This is BreakPoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Welcome to another edition of BreakPoint This Week. I'm Shane Morris here with John Stonestreet to talk about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, I think we're striving to be much more than an all coronavirus all the time show here. But
well, if we did that, we'd be way better than every other news outlet. I mean,
well,
you scan the headlines. That's and it's understandable. That's not a bad thing. I'm kind of excited that we at least had a break from 12 straight months of the political campaign. So, there's a bright side to this whole thing.
I was going to say, once we get back to the normal news cycle, there's nothing in the rest of 2020 that's going to possibly dominate all the headlines.
Oh, man. Yeah. And now Joe Biden's the front runner, and we're going to have some very interesting things. I think I speak for all of Americans when I say, please let's not suspend debates, in light of the coronavirus, because it's going to be must-see TV watching, and plus it's going to feed our comedy sketch shows, just a steady stream of material. But let's not jump off on that. Although I will say I do share some real concerns that what's going to happen on the Democratic side, because Joe Biden doesn't seem well. He just doesn't. I'm speaking, we're all doing it from our homes, so none of us are looking as good as we're made up to be. But there's some real interviews where it just seems like all the synapses just kind of aren't connecting or firing, and it's really something.
Yeah, and I don't think either of our feelings toward this are approximate ridicule. I genuinely feel sorry for the guy. It doesn't seem like he should be running a presidential campaign.
That's right. I mean, it's interesting. And of course, we've got the other conversation, which is that the campaign pulled the Democrats even further to the left. And that's a very interesting, which primary campaigns tend to do. But just when you talk about abortion rights in particular, and then kind of our flirtations with socialism, I was just this morning listening to the New York Times Daily podcast, and Michael Barbaro was interviewing Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And I mean, you listen to young left-leaning politicians like that, and it's not accurate to say that they're left-leaning at all. They are legitimately seeing the window open up for way more socialist policies, and also talking too about, and I struggle with this one, Shannon. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this one. I mean, I look at this and think, the way we're going through something like this, the pandemic, is so much better than it ever would have been in human history, right? I mean, if we go back to 1500s or 1600s or even the 1800s,
no question,
and the Spanish flu in the early 1900s, we're doing this in, many of us in comfortable houses, certainly not all of us, but a whole lot more of us than would have been with, increasing employment, access to food. The food chain supply is broken down. And yet there is a sense that this is the worst thing that could possibly happen to us, and it's revealing the social inequities. It does reveal social inequities. There's no question about it. Mm-hmm. But I just feel like we're all starting on a much higher level of social inequity than we would have back in the early 20th century.
And how much telework took place in 1918?
Well, that's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And there's people that are, forced to go into work, and they, in certain cities in particular, disproportionately affect people of different ethnic minorities, people of color, and so on. So I get all that. I mean, these are legitimate things that they get revealed, but it's such a better world to go through this than it was 100 years ago, at least in the health sense and in the financial stability sense. It's interesting, though, that this generation that is kind of the AOC sort of way of seeing things is seeing this as a real opportunity to bump into socialism, and that it's almost inevitable. It was just interesting to hear her talk like that.
Yeah, and I try to keep in mind also, John, how someone pointed out to me this week that those who are sort of more open to a continued shutdown tend to be those with white-collar jobs who can telework. And I try to keep that in mind because I haven't had to cut back on work. I'm able to still work from home. Whereas many people are not, and they're feeling the pinch right now. And this is a crisis for them on the level of losing their homes and not being able to feed their families. So it's, I think Victor Davis Hanson is right. He wrote earlier this week at the Daily Signal about how we're reaching what he calls a gut check moment with the coronavirus crisis, where in a couple of weeks, we're probably going to have more testing deployed, where we're going to know a lot more about how many people are really infected, how deadly this thing really is. And then there's going to be a lot of, second guessing about these shutdowns on federal, state, and local levels. And a lot of people are going to have to either be vindicated or answer for the decisions to shut down and crash the economy. And leaders are going to have to retroactively, I think, or at least they're going to feel in the position like they need to retroactively sell this thing. Like they have to justify having shut down the economy and cost so many people their jobs.
Right, as if we haven't already been living through that over the last however long. I mean, you're right. There's no doubt about it. I just read Victor David Hanson's piece, and again, we'll link to it in the show notes, and just thought, yeah, well, there was no good news. It was just, hey, here's where we are, that we're going to basically have a whole another chapter of this, everyone claiming to be completely confident in what they know. And they're going to be tempted, and it's what's going to happen is it's going to be politically driven rather than data driven.
Yeah, because this is an election year, and so the incentive is going to be for each side to blame the other and attack the other and act like, well, this is all your fault. And there's probably some fault to go around, John. I mean, people make mistakes, and especially in high office, they should answer for those mistakes to the electorate. But I think we also need to be very careful to avoid the temptation to basically impute failures to those who are political opponents who we want to lose elections, and vice versa, to impute competence where there is no competence because we want someone to win an election.
And motives, right? And
motive.
Imputing motives as well as competence. And also just pretending like once we're looking back, it's all 2020. I mean, we saw this coming out of the Iraq War, where every single person in Washington...
Or Monday morning quarterbacking. There's another sports reference for you, John.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good. You're getting out more. You're watching some sports documentaries during this lockdown. I just go back to the Iraq War, where everybody was for it until they were against it on both sides of the aisle. Like, it was obvious this is the right thing that we should do. And we're seeing the same thing now. Do we want the president to tell the governors what to do, or do we not? Do we want to lock down, or do we not? Is the ban on travel to and from China a racist thing, or is it not? And it goes back and forth because, you know what? Hindsight is 2020. And, this isn't unprecedented in the sense that the world has never done this before. But it is unprecedented in the sense that we never had so many things economically at stake, and the 24-hour news cycle and that sort of stuff playing into it. And it's been a long time since anybody had done anything anywhere resembling this. This is where it gets so frustrating, is when mistakes are revealed, and they will be. Of course we mess this up. It's kind of like a parent cutting the apron strings on their first kid. Of course they're going to screw this up. I tell kids this all the time when I speak to them, especially like 17-year-old boys that are having trouble with their moms. Of course you're having trouble with your moms because you're a 17-year-old boy and she's your mom.
Turns out every 17-year-old boy in history has had trouble with his mom.
In the history of the planet. And you need to give her a break, and you need to love her, and you need to realize that she's doing this out of good intention. Now, I'm not saying that everyone did everything politically out of good intention there in this time, but I'm just saying, look, we need to have a little bit of realization that we're muddling through this, and we're trying to go forward. One good piece of advice, though, Shane, that I want to hearken back to Ed Stetzer, our former colleague here at BreakPoint this week, who will tell you, and if you see him, why'd you fire me? Because he's not with us anymore. He's on and off to better things on his own show. But he wrote a piece, and this has been kind of a soapbox that he's been standing on for a while. And I think it's there's a reason. He wrote about it in 2016 in the election.
Yeah.
I often say, here you had a bunch of nefarious Russians over there trying to interfere with our election. And here's what they came up with. Facebook post, and that says a lot more about us than it does about anybody else.
At least in Stranger Things, they opened a door to another dimension to get at the United States.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it would have been so much cooler if something like that would have, if alien beast would have been unleashed on the planet. But nope, memes. There you go. That's the big strategy. But, he wrote a good piece in Christianity Today, which says that we shouldn't fall for those conspiracy theories. Now, of course, even this week, it was very interesting because the idea that, a coronavirus came from a lab, not from a bat, We don't know, and there seems to be more.
Well, I think it was both. It seemed like a both kind of thing, because Ed actually clarified at the end of his article. He put a postscript and said, I'm getting a lot of responses. People are saying, well, it's reported now that it's possible and even likely that this came from a viral research lab in Wuhan. And he responded, I think appropriately, he said, now look, when I'm talking about the conspiracy theory there, I'm talking about the idea that this is a biological weapon that was cooked up in order to attack the United States or whatever other enemy. And in that case, it was the worst deployed biological weapon ever, because it ended up killing thousands of Chinese. But yeah, it very well may have been a natural virus that escaped in a lab. I don't think anyone has ever denied that possibility.
That's right. But part of this is just being patient. And in other words, when not just immediately sharing something because it makes your guys look good and it makes the other guys look bad. And we've all got to be careful, because again, I think hindsight's 2020. We don't know what we're doing. We're walking into this with the best data that we have, and that data is obviously continually being corrected, including, the overall infection numbers, the death numbers, everything.
Well, there's a lot we can do, though, to cultivate discernment in the midst of that. And I think that's the value we really need to be leaning heavily on, especially as Christians who are, as Ed says, people dedicated to telling the truth. When I wrote about it this week, I talked about how we need to know ourselves and what we want to be true before we start thinking about, what is true, because it's helpful to know your biases. We also need to avoid attributing malice to what can be explained by incompetence. That's an old, that's the old rule, the old saw against conspiracy theories. It's like the world is far more incompetent than malicious, and it turns out it's actually very hard, as Chuck Colson knew, to keep a conspiracy secret, even within a group of about 12 people. So, something on this scale would be very, very hard to conceal. I also think we need to remember, Proverbs 18:17, that the first to state his case will seem right. The first time you come across a link that makes a claim on Facebook or Twitter, it's going to seem right to you until you've, read the opposition, until you've read someone take it apart and, deal with those claims. And then it's not going to seem so credible after all. And there's all kinds of other things we can do, John, like cultivate humility as we try to discern what's true and what's not. And then I think we also need to avoid, as Lewis puts it in the Screwtape Letters, believing things because we think they reflect some kind of fashionable value. So he tries to, through the mouth of Screwtape, tries to get his patient to believe things because they're stark or courageous or conservative or clever or whatever. They adhere to some value. And he said, conceal from your patient the question that matters, which is it true? And that's the question we need to be asking ourselves, I think, as we try to discern the confusing news cycle.
And I think the value of what Victor David Hanson wrote, what Ross Douthat wrote this week, is that, okay, now we've got to make the next round of decisions. And of course, we saw the president make that really the front and center topic, at least of the latter part of the week, in his daily press briefings. When do we open the country back up? And when you add in not only our political biases, but our geographic biases. New York has been terrible. South Dakota has not. And, Florida has been hard. California has been okay. And, we have different curves and models showing different things growing, and you've got, all kinds of things happening. So these are really hard decisions. And I do think it's time, by the way, to start opening the country back up at some level. And I think that there's got to be a middle ground between a complete lockdown and a complete open up and so on. And hopefully we can figure out a way to get there.
You just have to.
Because it's not just lives, as we said on BreakPoint, it's not just lives, it's livelihoods. And they're just being devastated.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be in political office right now. I do not envy the county level.
Yeah, it's way easier for us to be on radio.
We're just we're just armchair quarterbacking. We're just going to evaluate these decisions after the fact and tell them what they did wrong.
That's right. There you go.
Well, John, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Folks, stay with us.
We invite you to visit breakpoint.org, and while you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of books and other resources, and you can find links to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
We're back on BreakPoint this week. I'm here with John Stonestreet talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And folks, come to breakpoint.org for links to all the stories that John and I have mentioned today on the program. John, I want to come back to a perennial topic that we've addressed here on BreakPoint this week, and that's China and what's happening in China in the midst of all this. You know, we talked about armchair quarterbacking, but there really is a point at which you have to recognize incompetence, malfeasance, and, you know, propaganda and just wrongdoing in the midst of something like this. And China has been just a horrific offender there, not just in terms of, I think, the cover-up and misinformation and propaganda as the coronavirus emerged there in Wuhan, which was devastating, not only for China, but for the world, and was documented at a great piece at National Review by Jim Garrity, but also the renewed persecution of Christians. John, I talked recently with Bob Fu, who's our Wilberforce Award winner and the director of China Aid, and he told me that this is like a little taste of the Maoist days.
Mao, yeah.
It's like we're going back to the Cultural Revolution in a way. And we've got stories out of China this week, John, that just boggle the mind, where officials are using this opportunity to take down crosses on top of churches because they're higher than the Chinese flag, which is required. You're required to fly that at every church. And Bob Fu even told me at many churches, the provinces will require you to put up a photo of Chairman Mao there in the church. And I told him, I'm vividly reminded of the stories of the early Christians, where they were told to give a pinch of incense to Caesar in participation with the imperial cult, and they refused, and they died for it. And that's very much the kind of thing that's happening in China. You know, they're being told to give their pinch of incense, just participate in this imperial cult in communist China, and they're refusing, and they're suffering for it.
Well, the stories that are coming out are just absolutely stunning. And I want to start with the religious freedom part of it and our brothers and sisters over there, because it's as bad as it's been and it's getting worse. And, you know, reports of, you know, Chinese officials storming into homes where Chinese Christians were on a Zoom church meeting. In other words, this has not clearly, clearly nothing to do. And by the way, giving some of the stories that have come out of some of the states, you know, with some of these governors in the U.S., I don't suspect that's going to happen. But at the same time, it's been absolutely horrific for these Chinese Christians. And they're using that opportunity. This is an example of never let an opportunity go to waste and never let a crisis go to waste. And that's what's happening over there. But I also want to just speak for a second, because the other thing that's emerging is just how bad things have been in China, just how much they muddled this and how much the propaganda machine has tried to hide it. I had a conversation this week with a friend who had spent the last several years in China. And, you know, just based on how he saw things operate right there, you know, for example, reports that the country's back open again, he said, no, there's some parts of it that are back open, but there, you know, a lot of parts certainly are not. Heard reports Friday morning that the death toll in Wuhan was about 3 times, and this was official reports, was about 3 times what they initially reported. And their excuse was, oh, you know, just, you know, calculation errors. I asked my friend, I said, look, what would you suggest based on your understanding of how Chinese officials communicate, like what the death toll is? And he goes, without blinking, I would say 5x. Without blinking, it's going to be 5x. Now, it could be 8 to 10x.
Well, we heard reports that, you know, the cell phone users have dropped by something like 2 million in China. I mean, it's anybody's guess what that means. But that's terrifying. I mean, the economic situation there is going to be devastating. And I think the rest of the world really is grumpy about this. And hopefully they go beyond grumpy to some level of, you know, look, we can't let this happen. Whether it's a crackdown on the wet markets because of the potential infection and disease, whether it's just basically realizing you cannot trust communist China. You just literally cannot trust them. Yeah, I heard a good phrase a couple weeks ago. It was totalitarian blindness. I forget who wrote about it. But it's the idea, you saw it even in something like Chernobyl with the Soviet Union, where officials are so worried about their superiors cracking down on them or sort of imputing incompetence to their superiors and, you know, ruining their reputation and costing them face, that they'll just sit on things and hide things and not talk about it until it's become such a problem that the superiors have to address it. And so it just ascends up the scale. And that's sort of the thing we saw play out in Wuhan, where the crisis was just sat on and concealed and lied about for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks of critical time when something could have been done to contain the virus. And now it's out worldwide. Yeah, and there was a book written years ago that said you can trust the communist to be communist. And I think we're being reminded of that again. Shannon, I want to talk too, though, about some of our own elected officials. There was a moment in time. So let me put it this way. I think that
a crisis like this, there are moments that kind of reveal where we're at as a society. It's usually not the crisis itself. It's something that emerges in the middle of the crisis. And it's kind of like that big yellow arrow on a map that says you are here. And I feel like we had one of those this week. Obviously, we've got, the continued opposition and stories. NBC News ran a piece about how the Samaritan's Purse Hospital in New York City continues to get flack. And I just look at that and go, this is crazy. We had tornadoes in Chattanooga on Sunday, and Samaritan's Purse had their relief facility set up by Monday. They move so fast and they do such great work. It's just unbelievable. But Andrew Cuomo, the New York governor, was actually talking about the curve flattening and what do we attest that to? And he said something that I don't think we would have heard even skeptics in American history like Jefferson or Ben Franklin say. And it wasn't solicited. You go back and look at the context, and it wasn't like, do you attribute this to prayer, or do you attribute this to, religious people doing good work? He just said, God did not do that. Faith did not do that. Destiny did not do that. A lot of pain and suffering did that. It was a statement of
anthropocentrism.
Thank you. Anthropocentric. That's the word I was trying to get at. Anthropocentric narcissism that you would see somebody like say in the privacy maybe of their own head, or write it in a disconnected context.
It's almost like he had an argument with someone on Facebook just before going
just
up there
moments
for the press
before
conference. Yeah.
No, that might be, because you kind of trace this out, and over the last several years in the wakes of shootings, we have seen, first of all, Facebook people and Twitter people say, don't give me prayers and thoughts, give me policy. And then you started to see elected officials on the left say that. And now you have Cuomo literally attributing it. And I've been thinking a lot about this. I did my weekly podcast with World Magazine on this, and a thing called Culture Friday, which I do each week over there. And there are times where you just kind of realize just how secular we are, because that's not something that you would have seen an elected official say. It's one thing to not attribute the success to God. It's another thing to directly
deny that it was
God's involvement in all of this.
Well, if I could get Presbyterian for a minute, the Westminster Confession walks us through this little false dilemma, and it says that this is classic Christian doctrine. I mean, Thomas Aquinas would say the same thing, that secondary causation, meaning the means, the natural causes that lead to something, does not abolish divine providence or predestination. It establishes it, rather, meaning God uses secondary means and causes to bring about his will. That's what we call providence in Christian theology. And apparently Governor Cuomo doesn't have a conception of that, or has rejected it on some level. But yeah, we believe that God not only works miraculously, but he also works through doctors and through governors, Mr. Cuomo, and through, churches, just people doing ordinary things that are within their power naturally. He also works miraculously, but there's a distinction there, and we need to understand that and give credit to him for it.
But you just go back through history, and elected officials from the top, in D.C. to the local level, often responded to these things by issuing proclamations of days of prayer and fasting and things like that. Yeah. And we just haven't seen much of that. I mean, I think the president involved himself in some, but we just wouldn't have seen anybody in that level of an elected office, directly deny God's existence unsolicited. It was just kind of a surreal moment. And to me, it just seems like this is in context of this larger thing that we've seen. And we've got a growing conflict where local magistrates have passed, certain ordinances about social distancing and stay-at-home orders. And you have people of faith abiding by them, but trying to get around them and a level of what...
trouble.
Yeah, a level of what Ross Douthat said is the sort of creativity we need at this time, like drive-in churches. And there was a remarkable exchange this week of a church that had a drive-in service, and the mayor of the town instructed the police of the town to go and issue tickets, and basically saying stuff about, the power of the local government to suspend First Amendment rights. First of all, it was just an exercise in ignorance. And here's the thing that struck me, Shane. This was in Greenville, Mississippi. You know where that is? That is like the deep South Christian, world.
That struck me as odd too. I would have expected this in the Northeast.
But here's why. So it's one thing when left-leaning officials and left-leaning places deem churches non-essential. Do you realize how out of step that is in American history to deem church as non-essential? Have you ever watched Little House on the Prairie? I have 3 daughters, so I've memorized all the episodes. Everything happened in the church, right? The church was the center of everything. This
Reverend
is one
Alden.
of the things. Well, that's right. And that's where they did school. That's where they did town hall meetings. That's where they, stayed safe from the blizzard. That's where they, beat up the town bully and kicked them out. That's where they did church. I mean, it was the center of things. And look, I'm not talking about the stay-at-home orders because, as I said this week.
We should note this church was doing a drive-in service, which means they had people go into their parking lots, stay in their cars, probably with the windows up and the AC on, and the pastor broadcast the sermon via some kind of short
FM radio.
Yeah, FM radio out to the
Yeah.
cars. This was completely consistent with social distancing.
Well, and we're seeing that, and we're seeing, local people trying to kowtow to the state people, and I think that's probably what was at work there. But here's my point, and is that some of these things reveal just how far we've moved. It's like you look up 20 years later and you realize we're not in the food court anymore, right? We're not in Kansas anymore. We've moved. We're at a different part of the mall. And we're at a level of secularity where, look, it's one thing to say as Christians, social distancing is the right thing to do out of love for God and love for neighbor. We sometimes come in conflict with the state, but we don't always come in conflict with the state. This is joint wisdom. We can do the right thing. It's another thing for churches to buy into the idea that they're non-essential. And I think so many Christians, without blinking, and this was kind of a realization of panic that I had today, that, and you and I talked about this, I think even last week, are people going to go back to church when it's so much easier to do online church, and what will be lost in all of that. But at a more fundamental level, or maybe at a 50,000-foot level instead of a 20,000-foot level, we live in a culture where the church has moved from being an essential part of people's lives, where religious experience has been an essential part of people's lives, and especially corporate religious experience, not just me and God or me and my, yoga. But I mean, like, we have become secular at a level that I think is being revealed. And I don't want to, nutpick Andrew Cuomo's comments, which were crazy. But I do want to point out that I think a whole lot of Christians would buy into the fact that when it comes to the day-to-day life, this is classic definition of practical atheism. Not that you believe God doesn't exist, but that we live as if God is irrelevant, where we're living as if church is irrelevant.
Or as Charles Taylor might put it, we're living in the imminent
frame. Yeah.
We've become practical secularists. And you see that in the numbers, John. You see that in just the way our towns are arranged. If you drive through an old town, you'll notice something right away. And that's that there's churches right there on Main Street. Or there's maybe a church street where there are a bunch of churches lined up. And those are the old mainline denominations. And most of those buildings are pretty much empty on Sunday. They're not well attended. They're living on endowments from older members. And then nowadays, if you drive through a newer city, you're not going to see churches on Main Street. You're going to see them, tucked away in warehouses and renting, school space and things like that. I'm not knocking that. I spent a lot of time in a church that rents space from a school because property is expensive in Northern Virginia. But that, I think, illustrates the loss of touch with church as an essential part of our life.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's not wrong.
Right? And then the numbers,
right, you do what
too.
you have to do to build a church, but you can see it when it happens on a kind of national scale that things have changed, things have moved.
Well, and then the numbers too
sure.
are what I think illustrates that 75%, something north of 75% of Americans still call themselves Christians. You know that only 37% attend church on a weekly or regular basis?
Faithful church attendance now is measured by, most of the organizations like Pew and Gallup and so on is once a month.
Right.
So, I mean, I tell you what, when I was growing up, it was 3 times a week. You were not a faithful attender unless it was Sunday morning, Sunday night.
Twice every
Sunday, once on Wednesday. And yeah, that's what faithfulness was.
You got to have a wanna. That's in the Bible.
I was a Sparky, man. I was a Sparky.
All right. Well, John, that finishes off the show for today. Folks, come to breakpoint.org for links to all of the stories, articles that John and I have mentioned today on the program. And there's also a lot of other great resources you can find there. So check us out at breakpoint.org. For John Stonestreet and for the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. Thanks for listening. We're back on Breakpoint this week. This is the extended edition for the online podcast. So congratulations, you guys get a little extra content here. John, we want to talk a little bit about actually it's a TV series that has come out on VidAngel, chronicling the life of Christ in a sort of unique way that hasn't been done before. And I think you've seen several episodes now.
Well, yeah,
I'll
talk about The Chosen here in a second, but I think we're all hitting that kind of, Netflix fatigue. Like, what are we going to do now? And, for some of us, like us introverts, this is like fantastic. This is, in a sense, I'm not struggling as an introvert, being able to just lock in with my kids and my family and all that sort of stuff.
When coronavirus social isolation hasn't changed your life at all.
Well, it has, because somehow as an introvert, I'm forced to get on planes, and I don't see another flight in my future for quite some time. But at the same time, I had a friend, several weeks ago talk about The Chosen, which is the first multi-episode series on the life of Jesus. Really interesting story where the initial Christmas episode was produced for a local church, and it just went over so well that the guy who produced it actually decided to turn this into a multi-episode series. And of course, it wanted to stay out of the Hollywood system just because of the way, the restrictions and so on. So they put it up for crowdfunding and raised I think it was $11 million. It broke all records for crowdfunding of anything yet in history. Just stunning. And so season 1's out. It's part of VidAngel, but they've actually made it completely free on YouTube. So you can just go to YouTube and pick it up. But we're about 4 episodes in. And one of the things I appreciate about it, Shane, is that it's dramatized, and there are details that are not necessarily in the text, but there's nothing there that has been reinvented or recreated. So when you try to make sense of the large catch of fish, or, you have this reference later on in the Gospels of Mary Magdalene, being healed of demon possession. But that's not the scene when Jesus does it. It doesn't really appear in the Gospels. And so where does that fit? And how did Mary Magdalene fit into the disciples? And what about that wedding at Cana? What was going on? First of all, it's just well done. It's not a bunch of people with Irish accents, doing Middle Easterners.
Or some guy that looks like he belongs in a surf shop out in California, playing Jesus and saying, "Come change the world with me, Peter Dude."
That's right. But I will say that one of the things I like about this too is that you either get the Peter Dude hipster Jesus, or a lot of times, or you get the super solemn, like esoteric spiritual guru Jesus, who's not very human. Yeah. And this Jesus has a sense of humor and a love for children. And the actor just does a really good job. So my kids are really enjoying it. It's bringing up really good conversation. So I want to recommend that one. The other one I want to recommend is something I talk about on BreakPoint on, Thursday, which is a tremendous sports documentary, which ends up not being about sports at the end of the day. It's called Jump Shot the movie. My college basketball coach, who's been working with Athletes in Action now for a long time as kind of a basketball specialist with them and working with coaches and so on, had something to do with this film. But, if you're new to basketball, or if you love basketball, it's easy to think the jump shot's always been there. You go back to, early footage of basketball players, and it's not a very fast-paced game. There were some evolutionary stages between Naismith at the YMCA and Steph Curry and Kevin Durant today.
Yeah, it's just people calmly walking around the court and then planting themselves and carefully throwing it into the
two-hand set shots. Yeah. Nobody's within 3 feet of you, and then somehow that moved from that to these running crazy one-handers, which
basketball without dunking and jumping is like NASCAR without crashes.
But the thing that's interesting is that Kenny Sailors was named the top player of the NCAA tournament in the 1940s. The University of Wyoming, which it's in the middle of nowhere now. Back then, they had to get on a train and basically go play people because nobody would come play them. But they were such a good team, and Sailors was their leader. They won the NCAA tournament and then went on to win the NIT in the same year, which doesn't happen anymore, but beat Georgetown and St. John's, like perennial powerhouses. And in that kind of, national stage of Madison Square Garden, he ended up inventing, he didn't invent it. He invented the jump shot because he was trying to shoot over his older brother who kept blocking his shot. He was 6'5". And so he just perfected this brand new way of doing it. And if you look at it and then you look at Steph Curry today, it looks like the same shot. In other words, this is the shot that everybody around the world continues to shoot. And he's really changed the game. But what you end up finding out is he disappeared from the scene. He went to fight in the Pacific in World War II. He came back, played a little bit longer, but his wife had some respiratory issues, and they moved to Alaska for her health. And he dropped out of the NBA. And then it was funny, Shane, we talked about his life on a BreakPoint commentary, and one of my former colleagues at Summit Ministries, a girl from Alaska who would come work our camps in the summer, she wrote and lived not too far from, I think it's Glen Allen, Alaska, and said the guy's a legend up there because he just faithfully worked at a school, coached, taught PE, and also built girls basketball, giving girls a chance to play these games, including Native Americans and Eskimos.
And he's an underappreciated legend, too, from what you say in the commentary. Like, he didn't make it into the basketball equivalent of the Hall of Fame.
The Naismith Hall of Fame is weird. All the other Hall of Fames have these kind of public ballots and sports people vote, and there's like an Illuminati of the Naismith Hall of Fame. Nobody knows who they are, and they voted. And it's crazy. I mean, you list the greatest NCAA players of each decade, which they did a couple years ago, and you go from Christian Laettner in the 90s, and forget Larry Bird in the 80s, and who was the 70s? I'm blanking out. But then 60s Bill Walton, 50s Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. I mean, this is like a lineup that's unbelievable. And Kenny Sailors is the one in the 40s, and he gave the world the jump shot, and he championed basketball in the nether regions of Alaska, and he's not in the Hall of Fame. But I tell you, here's what happens. He passed away a couple of years ago in his 90s, moved back to Wyoming after his wife died, and what this story becomes is a story about faith. He was at the Final Four one year, and the story's told at the end. And the story's great. The film's great, by the way. You have all these NBA legends that are there talking about his contribution. And Coach Bobby Knight, who's one of the most colorful characters in U.S. history, much less basketball history. But in the middle of it, he says, my Final Four is God, my family. What was the next thing? My country and the Marines. In that order. And basketball wasn't even in his top 5. So they're making this film about him, a big deal about him, and he clearly thinks, I wasn't that big of a deal, but he influenced. It's the power of a quiet yet super well-lived life, and also one that took faith really seriously.
It's kind of an Eric Liddell story in its own way.
It is, yeah. I mean, he saw sports as a way to express his worship.
As a means of glorifying God and expressing, his worship.
And then
exactly.
When that wasn't available, he coached sports, and he used that as a way to influence others. And it's really awesome. I'd say there's a couple moments there too, Shane, and you knew Chuck Colson, and maybe it's the Marine connection. You just see these very, very human guys, committed to doing the right thing and making a difference in other people's lives. What about you? Do you got any other, before we close out here, any other recommendations for people who are going stir crazy?
Yeah, sure, John. I'm always torn when it comes to the, entertainment based on Jesus' life, because on the one hand, I really want it to be as faithful to the text as possible. But on the other hand, I really value historical, dramatization and fictionalization, because it makes so much sense out of it. And there's a lot of, honest and responsible dramatization you can do. And it sounds like The Chosen does that. So I'll plan on checking that out with my family. But I'll tell you, on the other end of the spectrum, the thing that we've just really benefited from in the last few years is this 2014 series by the Lumo Project. And it's the 4 Gospels, directed by David Batty. And what they do is they have a narrator read the Gospels, just the text of the Gospels all the way through from start to finish. And then these actors portray it while they're speaking Aramaic, and they're actually, it's almost like you've got a videotape of the events as they actually took place. There's no modern languages or anything like that. But it's just this beautiful illustrated Bible sort of thing. And the actor for Jesus is really unique too. He's the exact opposite of a pretty boy Jesus. Yeah, he's, I cannot pronounce his last name. I believe he's Indian or Pakistani, but he's got this just intensity to him and a humor as well. You can see him, just laughing with the disciples over dinner and interacting with his followers in a way that a very human Jesus would. And yet it's profoundly respectful of the text of the Gospels. And I love how they illustrate the parables and the prophecies and so forth. And the Olivet Discourse is, it's worth the whole thing. But yeah, that's on Netflix. All 4 of those are on Netflix. And those are just really helpful for getting this warp and woof of the Gospels, especially for your kids. And so over Easter, we watched the relevant segments of a couple of Gospels. I think we picked Luke as our main go-to on that, but it was just great. And then the other one that
I was just going to say, it's not often we remember that these things, are kind of in a tradition that goes all the way back early on in Christianity of illustrated Bibles and stained glass windows and ways that some of this truth was illustrated and embellished, right? I mean, if you look at early Christian art versus Byzantine versus, more modern, where people are in kind of still paintings trying to tell these stories, there's things that are added and they are in video, and it's a dangerous thing, and you want to keep your, discerning mind open between that which the scripture says and that which it doesn't, that becomes kind of things of myth or legend, but basically retelling the story in creative ways. It's part of what the church has been about for a long time.
Yeah. I'll tell you the other thing real quickly that my wife and I found on Netflix was Pixar's Onward. It ended up going straight to online streaming I think, after the theatrical run because of the lockdowns and everything. They're trying to recover from that. But, we had heard a lot of chatter about how Onward has this exclusively lesbian moment, right? And that was what made all the headlines and got everyone's attention. And I suspect a lot of Christians saw that and just sort of wrote the movie off. They were like, I'm not going to watch this one. I'll tell you what, we watched that. I was looking for it, and it was another one of those cough and you'll miss it throwaway remarks by a tertiary character. It was almost not even in there. Your kids will never catch it. But the rest of the movie, though, was just immensely wholesome. I mean, if you've ever been into kind of the fantasy genre, this is a story about brotherly love. It's, learning to put your family ahead of yourself. And then it's about the need for a father. I mean, it's the most traditional conservative story I think Pixar has done maybe since Up or Coco or something like that. So, I'd cautiously recommend that one. There's obviously some obeisance being paid in there, as in many movies these days, to the LGBT agenda. But the rest of the movie is just so high quality, it's hard not to recommend it.
Well, that's a good recommendation. I know my kids we were talking about it, and I'd heard some of those headlines, so we might check that one out too.
Well, folks, that wraps it up for this week. Come to breakpoint.org for links to all the stories and articles that John and I have mentioned today on the program, and we'll be back with you next week to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Thanks so much for listening. For John Stonestreet and for the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.